The elections are still going on in one of the largest democracies in the world. While one party is promising welfare, the other is promising growth. Let's discuss these elections with Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. Namaste, JP sir.
Hello, Sharanya. Namaste.
Sir, in the ongoing elections, one party is promising welfare while the other is promising growth. Now, both the parties are making caste and religion as the basis for their campaign. Now, what are your thoughts on the 2024 election, sir?
There are two elements in the question that you asked, Sharanya. The first is we have not still created an electoral framework or a political culture in which people are unable to discover the consequences of the vote. Let me give a simple example. Only this morning I watched on BBC a very heartrending show about the impact of global warming on the poor women in India, particularly pregnant women and the unborn babies or young kids. As part of that, they showed in Hyderabad city, our own city where we are now, how once in 4 days the poor families are getting water through tankers, very small quantity of water, and for their drinking, their cleaning, their cooking, they have to utilize that water in those 4 days. Supposing they exercise their franchise, there's a clear connect in their minds between the vote they give and the assured water supply they receive to have a better quality of life. A simple issue. After all, getting a decent quantity of water, potable water, for your drinking, for your cooking, and for your cleaning purposes is very fundamental. Supposing the vote actually has that consequence, then the way a poor citizen, in most cases illiterate or uninformed, would respond to politics and elections is different from the way it is happening in large parts of the country. Now, in the absence of that link, that whomever I vote for, it is not making a difference to the quality of my life in a manner that I understand or to my family, then what happens is the vote will be bought by money. In the southern states, excluding Kerala, it has now become endemic. Let's be very candid about it. We all talk about the north-south divide, and we think south is a better region. In some respects, maybe, simply because they had an advantage of 50, 100 years of Raitwari system, as opposed to Zamindari system in some other parts of the country in British India. And therefore, there are certain consequences once the ownership of the farmers is recognized for long. But that apart, the truth is, in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, election cost is astronomical. Why? Vote buying has become endemic. Per vote in Andhra Pradesh assembly election, you ask people, per vote, there are constituencies where each candidate paid about 5,000 rupees. I'm not saying everywhere everybody paid that amount. There's almost no assembly segment where a major party candidate spent less than 30 or 40 crores. Britain is having the elections now. On July 4th, the election is to be held. Sitting here, I can tell you with absolute confidence, the total cost of British election for all the major political parties and for all the candidates of all the major parties in 650 parliamentary constituencies, it will be less than 1,000 crores equivalent in pounds sterling at the current at the current exchange value. It will be probably about of the order of about 100 million pounds. If you take the current purchasing power, it will be of the order of about maybe 300 crores or 250 crores. And we are spending in one state, a relatively small, not a very big state, a moderate sized state, in a poor country, in the state level election, probably 10 to 15,000 crores, some people say 20,000 crores in Andhra Pradesh alone. Now, the reason why you have to spend that kind of money is you have to entice the voters who don't see any value in voting. Even to come to the polling booth, you have to have paid money. There are many cases where the poor people say, because they have not distributed money, we will not go to the polling booth, we will boycott the polls. The second way it manifests is short-term freebies. Because my vote is not making a difference to my life. At least if you give me free power, free water, free transport, free something else, it's tangible. And if even that doesn't work, then we have the age-old caste and religion and regional divides in the country. We are a very complex and diverse society. It's very easy to provoke primordial loyalty. It's a group identity rather than the family interest. So we must understand the process at work. So the first is the vote is not linked to the consequences in your life. And the second is India is on the growth path. Actually, for a country with universal franchise, abject poverty, mass illiteracy, it's amazing that we're able to maintain universal franchise and freedom and a democracy, political democracy, and yet able to achieve modest growth, sometimes reasonably high growth. But let's be truthful. There is no majority for economic growth in India. Why? Because a significant section of the population, the poorer sections, whose productivity is low for no fault of theirs, because the quality of education is substandard, because the nature of urbanization is highly centralized surrounding big cities. So there is no possibility for the ordinary rural folk, 65% of the population of India, to envision a better life for themselves in the neighborhood. Now, once there is no majority for growth, if you want to somehow get a mandate, and if you are committed to economic growth, you have to somehow create a framework in which the primordial loyalties or the money power play a dominant role. And that's what's happening. Because if the majority are denied the participation in the growth process, if growth is benefiting disproportionately a smaller section of the more skilled people with capital, with urban living, etc., then it's very difficult to sustain economic growth through electoral politics. So instead of blaming XYZ, each party is playing this game. For the past 60, 70 years, the game of caste as a means of mobilization politically has been endemic in India. Because that's easy. When there is no link between vote and the effect it has on your life or the family's life, it's easy to talk about your caste, your region, your religion. That's been happening all through. So I would appeal to all the thoughtful citizens and scholars to go beyond the symptoms, beyond what we are seeing. Very crass appeal to the caste sentiment or regional sentiment or religious sentiment. It is true. But any amount of heroism or any amount of moralizing will not help. We have to figure out what is wrong with our growth model, how to bring the majority into the growth process, and therefore make a rational argument for prosperity for the families and the society at large, and get the vote. And how to create a link between the vote that they give and the consequences that follow in their lives in a very personal way. And we have failed in both, and we have to really address them. No matter who assumes office at the national level or in the states in this election, I think the next 5-10 years are about making growth inclusive and deepening democracy in a manner that the vote has consequences to the families' lives.
Yes, sir. So, like you mentioned, the Britain's election process has started recently, and the main political discourse that is being highlighted in the British elections are, mainly focused on the improvement of their NHS and increasing their delivery services and Britain's economy. So, whereas when we compare the Britain's election process to India, the main political discourse for Indian politician or a voter is mainly focused on caste, religion, freebies, and it is seen majorly in rural areas and sometimes in urban areas also, that the voters are mesmerized by these politics and the politicians. They don't see what they get from this elections, or like you said, the consequences of their vote. Now, where do you think the politicians and the voters are failing to understand the consequences of their vote and the growth that is required in the current modern times? And is there any identity crisis amongst voters that is forcing them to see caste and religion as a basis?
Saranya, first of all, voters cannot be held responsible. That's a very cheap and easy way without any solution. That's a very silly approach. Because please remember, the people of India did not say we want universal franchise. They did not say we want this or that electoral system. It is the elites of India, the leadership of India during freedom struggle and during the constitution making that decided that we are no different from a France or a Germany or a Japan or Britain or United States or some other country which have very robust functioning liberal democracies. Therefore, we will institute such a liberal democratic polity in the country. And therefore, it is the duty of these elites to build institutions in a manner that the people understand the meaning of the vote in their lives. That failure is not that of the voters. That failure is that of the elites of the country, then and now. Otherwise, if you blame the voters, you'll never find a solution. And in fact, you could really argue based on evidence, it is the poor people, the illiterate people, the ordinary voters that are sustaining our democracy. They are voting in larger numbers in the country. They are voting with great hope and anticipation. They are facilitating peaceful transfer of power despite so many divides in the country. So, first of all, it's not the voter, it is the elites, then or now. Now, what is happening is caste has become the single biggest source of mobilization of people. Take Britain. As I said rightly, the National Health Service, the healthcare system, the prices, the economy, and the demographic transition, because all these are aging societies, therefore to maintain a welfare model with fewer and fewer workers is going to be a challenge. So these are the issues. Therefore, the debate and the voting preferences are based on those things. Because people are unable to understand what is there in it for them. Most people understand it pretty clearly. But even then, even in a country like Britain, the primordial loyalties do surface. For instance, immigration is going to be a big issue. Rishi Sunak is talking about Rwanda being the destination for all the people who seek asylum until their cases are disposed of, and trying to mobilize the vote on that basis. And many other European countries, including the Netherlands, a very civilized country, very rich country, even a country like Germany, for instance, or France, or many other countries, or of course United States, building a wall on immigration. So these divisive issues, polarizing issues are gaining in dominance. So if you mean in rich countries, very prosperous, well-educated countries with strong systems and clear link between the vote and the consequences, there is a temptation to resort to primordial loyalties. You can imagine the difficulties in a poor and illiterate country. You must remember that there is no poor country which embraced universal franchise from day one and sustained it with peaceful transfer of power and has become prosperous. Even if you eliminate the last one, India is almost alone in the world to embrace universal franchise and sustain it without any interruption except for a small interregnum between 1975 and 77, and have peaceful transfer of power and retaining liberty at large. And then aim at prosperity and economic growth is an extraordinary thing. Therefore, extra steps should be taken in our country. We failed to do that. We simply had normative democracy. We have the vote, we have regular elections, we have political freedoms. It became a vote and shout democracy. Therefore, the two critical things required for growth and prosperity on the one hand, and a democracy devoid of polarization on the other hand, they demand two fundamental things. Can you make a large proportion of Indian population, a majority, have a genuine hope and aspiration? That with economic growth, with rational policies, without freebies and without polarization and divisions in society, can you give them hope that my children will be better off in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Our incomes will grow, our quality of life will improve. Can we give that woman in the Hyderabad slum the confidence that our water supply will improve because of her vote? And can you bring a link between the vote and the consequences? The first one necessarily means inclusive growth. While India is now showing signs of robust growth, it is still not inclusive growth. It is not about one government or one term or something. For the past 60, 70 years, we failed to do the necessary things required to enhance the productivity of the ordinary poor people. The productivity comes from genuine quality education so that your minds are flowering, so that your productivity goes up. You can become a productive member of a modern society. Because in this day and age, you cannot simply plow the land or dig the pits and fill the pits and find employment. You have to use the mind. It's an age of machines, age of technology. Everybody may not require fancy degrees, but basic ability, numeracy, literacy, ability to understand a problem, apply your knowledge to solve a problem. If the basic school education is missing, and we don't have basic school education, everybody goes to school but there's no education. And if big cities are the fulcrums of economic growth, and for the bulk of the people of India living in rural India, to go to a big city and live there with any modicum of dignity and security is near impossible dream. That means growth is not touching them. Then why will you get a majority for growth? Take Telangana state. A few months ago we had the assembly election in this state. The electoral outcome was quite striking. If the parties and the political system and the elites of India and the media don't learn lessons from that experience, it will be a very great tragedy for the country. We are all bothered about which party is winning, which party is losing. No, that's not the issue. In Hyderabad and surrounding areas, in 24 assembly segments, everywhere Congress was rejected. Congress offered all kinds of short-term welfare at the cost of long-term good. They offered 1,20,000 crores additional expenditure annually on welfare. 1,20,000 crores additional expenditure when there is no money available. Despite that, Hyderabad and surrounding areas, 24 assembly segments rejected it. Whereas go to rural areas, by and large, they accepted the Congress agenda. What's the difference? In Hyderabad and surrounding areas, there is a perceptible economic growth touching the lives of most of the people. So people could see the distinction between the long-term investment into the future of their children and better incomes and better growth opportunities. And they rejected the short-term freebies because they intuitively realized the short-term welfare of that magnitude is at the cost of long-term economic growth because there's no money for investment. Whereas the rest of the state, outside of Hyderabad and outskirts of Hyderabad, they did not feel they are partners in economic growth model. At least a majority did not feel that they will benefit from economic growth, though growth does benefit everybody. Growth is like a rising tide. A rising tide lifts all boats. But the boats relating to the poor are not lifted adequately to make a perceptible difference in their lives because there's substandard education. Without education, you have no skill. Without skill, there is no ability to earn. And there is very inadequate healthcare. Therefore, even a minor healthcare crisis means most families are on the verge of ruin. And urbanization is very skewed. Unless you change these things and create an inclusive growth model, there will not be a majority for growth. Look at Narendra Modi. Whatever be the faults of the current government, their commitment to fiscal prudence, investment rather than short-term expenditure, whether it's infrastructure or investment promotion or something else, and putting the banks on a sound footing financially, restoring the health of the banks, they've done a very creditable job. The results speak for themselves. But despite that, they perceive, I sense, there is no majority for economic growth. Only urban, middle classes, reasonably educated people who see a sense of the future in economic growth, they are willing to support it, transcending all other differences. Now, if you want to carry the rest, you have to do two things. One, you have to really take care of the welfare. Mr. Narendra Modi's strength electorally is in the northern part of India, where welfare was not implemented effectively. In a manner, people can actually get the welfare without leakages, without corruption. Even if it's on a smaller magnitude than, let's say, in the south or the west of India. It was never implemented effectively. Mr. Modi actually delivered that in the northern states, and that probably is his enduring electoral base. It's not an accident. And even that is not enough. When others are offering even more welfare without regard to the resources availability or whatever, then you have to also, and others are polarizing on caste and other lines. You have to polarize on some other lines. Now, religion has become a very easy thing, particularly in certain parts of the country which have memories of partition. So it's easy to vilify either caste polarization or religious polarization. That is a moral sentiment. But how do you build institutional mechanisms to make people transcend that and create conditions in which political parties don't have to depend on polarization to get a majority for an agenda, but a rational thought? So the first most important thing is inclusive growth. And these are two or three elements that I mentioned: education and healthcare of real quality to enhance productivity, and urbanization model, and giving a genuine hope that economic growth actually gives my family, my kid, an opportunity. In the large part, we fail to do that in the case of the majority of people of India. I have no doubt about it. And I think that is the greatest challenge. Apart from decentralization that I hinted at, if the people feel, voting for Bharat Mata or voting for Telugu Talli or Andhra Pradesh or Tamil, all this is nice and sentimental, but it doesn't touch your lives, and you don't see the link between the vote and consequences. Therefore, very strong and empowered local governments is critical, and no party seems to be committed to that. Some parties perfunctorily say that, but they created, for instance, 73rd, 74th Amendments, they created overstructured, underpowered local governments, and they're all emasculated except in Kerala in general. So third tier really doesn't function. India has the most centralized government on earth. You cannot have poverty, universal franchise, high degree of centralization like this together and have a robust democracy, healthy democracy. You have to really rebuild local governments, very strong local governments, empower them, make them accountable, and make people see increasingly the link between the vote locally and the consequences. And if the only vote that matters is the state and national vote, our democracy will continue to hobble like this.
Yes, sir. So here you spoke about the failure of elites and the inclusive growth in the previous answer. Now, firstly, I would like to focus on the failure of elites. 20 years from now, in the 2004 elections, a similar situation was happening when Vajpayee government was promising India Shining campaign. However, it lost to the opposition narrative of Aam Aadmi. Now, how do you see 2004 election and 2024 election? Because if a
I
foundation
think
was
it's a
built.
great question. Anybody would agree, unless you are hyper partisan, that despite the enormous constraints in the sense of there was no stability, there were, I think, multiple parties coming together. In 99, actually, Vajpayee government was unseated. And then again came back with a slightly increased tally of seats. And sanctions are imposed by United States and others because the nuclear explosion in Pokhran in 1998. So in the face of these two very big challenges, the outcomes generated by Vajpayee government in terms of infrastructure and economic growth were remarkable. If today the mobile telephony has become ubiquitous in India, it was largely because of the work done at that time. If the national highways and the transport and other infrastructure has become very effective, very a matter of some pride for us as opposed to the absolutely decrepit infrastructure earlier, it is to the credit of Vajpayee government. So many of us, the middle classes, the urbanites, even those who were not politically or inclined in a partisan way, we all felt that was a very competent government, an 8% growth rate in the last years, and a remarkable improvement in infrastructure and communications, and competent management of the economy. They should ordinarily have given the mandate. And most of the pundits, most of the scholars, most of the psephologists and media, they all said, no, India Shining will win. But because there is no majority for economic growth in this country, Congress party took up the slogan of Aam Aadmi and all kinds of short-term welfare measures. Even if Vajpayee government delivered welfare, they did not focus on that in political communication. Suddenly, Aam Aadmi won. Congress party's slogan won, and welfareism dominated. But India was somewhat lucky because Dr. Manmohan Singh, the architect of economic reform in the country, and a team led by Dr. Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, whether it's Mr. Chidambaram, who was the Finance Minister at that time, or Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, or people like Dr. Rangarajan, who was in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. They were all broadly committed to economic growth, and there was still a consensus for economic growth in the country across parties. Whereas the National Front, which for a short time was governing the country, coalition with Congress support, or the Vajpayee government, or the earlier Congress government of P.V. Narasimha Rao, or the Manmohan Singh government, there was a consensus for economic growth. Therefore, even if the economic growth-oriented Vajpayee government lost power, it did not bring about significant difference. Definitely the accent shifted from growth to welfare, from infrastructure to short-term welfare delivery. But it's not completely negated or neglected. But now what happened is the consensus that was there from 1991 to, let us say, about some 2010 or thereabout, for that period, for about 20 years, that now seems to have evaporated. There is no consensus for economic growth. That is a significant shift in the ground. What Mr. Narendra Modi has probably done is, it appears from a distance, that he has learned the lessons of Mr. Vajpayee very well. So he focused on delivery of welfare, even as he focused on infrastructure and economic growth. In infrastructure economic growth respects, the Modi government is a continuation of Vajpayee government. But the significant departure is, he really made sure that welfare is delivered very competently in the northern states, where there was very poor welfare system in the first place, and delivered very badly, a lot of leakages. And that became actually, I think, his electoral base. But he probably feels even that is not sufficient. While welfare is necessary with growth, even that is not sufficient. Therefore, there is this propensity to try and use the fractures of our society to polarize. But I think he has learned the lessons of Vajpayee government, that growth alone will not give you a verdict. You must focus on welfare. Therefore, every one of the Prime Minister's speeches is also about welfare, whether it is the free rice on account of COVID when they started, what has happened, or the housing provided for the poor, or the toilets for the poor, or the water supply to the poor, or the gas cylinders given on subsidy to the poor, and so on and so forth. Now, impressively, they come out with numbers, Jan Dhan accounts, or the farmers, the Kisan, PM Kisan project, or the healthcare, the model that they borrowed from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, which they expanded to the whole country, the hospital, healthcare model, hospital-based model, Ayushman Bharat. So the focus in political communication is not only about economic growth and a better future, but on welfare. But because even that probably the ruling establishment feels is not sufficient, whenever they feel there is a certain stress, they also resort to some degree of polarization. I think there's a lot to learn from this experience of the last 20, 30 years in the country.
Yes, sir. So, my last question to you would be, in the start of election discourse, BJP focused on growth. Then the Congress released their manifesto, which was centered to social justice. Then, as the campaigning was going on, BJP's source of campaigning in the past few months has been very religious-centric. Now, why do you think the religion and caste are the central focus suddenly in the 2024 or in this elections?
I don't think it's very sudden, Sharanya. It's been there throughout. Caste has been always there in our politics. And in parts of the country, religion has been playing a role in politics. There's no question about it. We must view it in two ways. The first is Congress party, the party which really held the country together during freedom struggle and for a significant period after that. A party that built constitution and institutions. A party where it bungled in economic management in the first 3-4 decades, maybe 4 or 5 decades, but at least learnt from adversity and engineered economic reform under P.V. Narasimha Rao and Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh, has now become a party which is somewhat indifferent to economic growth. It's a very surprising development. Instead of embracing growth and looking at the inadequacy of growth alone and why inclusivity is required and what are the things that are required to make growth inclusive, they are sort of not even talking about economic growth seriously. And they became profligate. The promises offered by Congress party, and I say it with great pain and anguish because India requires two major parties which are broadly committed to economic growth and social justice and harmony in society, all three. If one party alone is committed to economic growth, other party is simply disregarding the importance of growth, we're in danger as a country. You cannot depend on one party and one leader as a country. Therefore, I say it with great anguish. Congress party seems to have given up on economic growth. There are perfunctory statements made about wealth creation, etc. But fundamentally, they are not creating the foundations for growth. Because fiscal discipline is the foundation of economic growth. Because without fiscal discipline, you have no resources to build infrastructure. You have no resources or to encourage investment. You cannot, in the global community, create confidence that the government will pursue growth path on a consistent basis. The kinds of short-term welfareism, which has gone completely berserk, offered by Congress party, apart from what is offered in states, like Telangana, I already mentioned to you, the Congress government offered more than 100,000 crores of annual additional expenditure only on welfare, and on already a state which is already very strong on welfare. So in addition to that, the union government's offer, in the sense that Congress party's offer in the union government, are extraordinary. 30 lakh jobs in union government. The total number of jobs in the union government and its agencies, including the armed forces, railways and public sector undertakings, is probably about 60 lakhs. And in the last 3-4 years, Narendra Modi government said, we will fill in 10 lakh posts in that, and I think they filled out 10 lakh posts. Where are 30 lakh jobs? What is the total number of 60 lakhs? In 1 year, you want to fill 30 lakh jobs? Where from? And at what cost? To serve whom? At the cost of the taxpayers? And loan waiver. And a commission on a perpetual basis to have loan waivers. It's disastrous fiscally, it's disastrous in terms of the credit culture in the future, the banking institutions in the future. Loan waivers create all perverted incentives. They destroy economic future of the country. We have so many loan waivers. And all kinds of things, money to the women, 1 lakh rupees for women per woman, poor families and something else. So there's no money. There's just no money in the kitty. After transferring monies to the states in terms of the Finance Commission devolution or various centrally sponsored programs, the government of India is left only with about 20 lakh crores revenues. Only about 20 lakh crores left. Out of the 42 lakh crores or so total revenues generated by government of India, 21.74 lakh crores go to states. The balance is only this much. Of that, about 11.91 lakh crores goes towards interest payments, about 12 trillion rupees. 7.68 lakh crores goes towards salaries and pensions. Together, they're taking care of all the money available. I have not talked about administrative expenditure. I have not talked about the government of India subsidies on food, on fertilizer, and many other things. I have not talked about other welfare programs like PM Kisan or Ayushman Bharat or something else. Without even talking about all that, already there's no money left. So you can certainly see clearly that whatever be the words, the consequences of their promises and their thought process is such that there is no possibility of a growth momentum in the country if these policies are pursued. It's an extremely dangerous situation. Now, that's the context in which suddenly the competing parties have to re-strategize. If they're focusing so much on welfare, disregarding the consequences to the fiscal management of the country and economic growth impulse and infrastructure in the future, then while you offer growth and the past 10 years of whatever they have done, certainly they can show the numbers, impressive accomplishments in terms of physical infrastructure and some growth momentum, so on. There's a lot more to be done, but at least they could show something. But they, I think, sense it's not enough. Therefore, they also must talk a lot about welfare, but even more important, they must somehow polarize society, because one side is caste polarization Another is religious polarization. And to me, all polarization is bad. Unless politics of individuation comes in the place of this group politics, group think. If each family, unless they start thinking about what is there in it for me and for my children, rather than for my caste and for my religion, democracy is incomplete. Right now, unfortunately, because of the party's non-commitment to economic growth in the long term, and therefore promoting prosperity and eliminating poverty rather than giving help to the poor, and lack of decentralization across the country, high decentralized modules in the country, and very poor service delivery, and enhancement of the capacity of the people, and finally, a growth model that benefits only certain segments of the population and excludes large segments for no fault of theirs. And all these need to be examined beyond politics, beyond Narendra Modi and Rahul Gandhi and Mallikarjuna Kharge and somebody else. We are too obsessed with a party and a personality. We are forgetting the processes and larger imperatives of Indian economy and polity.
Yes, sir. I would like to end this with this one question. Now, why is no major political party in India taking growth or seeing growth as a strong narrative in itself? And do you think if they take only growth as a strong narrative, 2004 will repeat?
Let me put it this way. Growth definitely has significant appeal, but not sufficient appeal to on its own carry you to power. Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, he was in those days regarded as a symbol of promotion of economic growth and not really favoring short-term welfare measures. He paid a very heavy price. He succeeded by Dr. Rajasekhar Reddy, and he found a superb combination of short-term welfareism and also long-term commitment to growth. I think that is the model. And that is the model Mr. Narendra Modi is now following. In Gujarat, he may or may not have followed the welfare model. But at the national level, he is following that model of combining both. And therefore, I think in any democratic society, to carry the majority of people, you require some degree of welfare. In other words, short-term alleviation of pain and suffering, of poverty and deprivation. It's not a bad thing, it's a necessary thing. But if politics is only that, then we are in danger. I think it's a judicious mix. And therefore, the way I look at it is, it's not growth versus welfare. It is growth and welfare versus welfare only. You take Andhra Pradesh today, the government currently in office, so for the past 5 years, gave a signal that it's welfare only. It's almost as if we don't want growth at all. So what we need is welfare and growth, and some fiscal discipline to make sure that you don't borrow in order to give welfare. That is where the danger is. Because basically, if I borrow and give short-term welfare, I am guaranteeing that the future of the next generation is mortgaged for the current generation's short-term benefit. It is affecting intergenerational equity. It is against ethos of Indian society. Every family across caste, region, religion, every family in India wants to sacrifice for the children. That is the uniqueness of our society. No family wants to borrow for current expenditure and pass on the debt burden to the children. If somebody does it, we regard them as monsters. How can our government do differently from our society? So at the very least, there must be a commitment over the next few years. Even if you don't achieve it overnight, there must be a commitment over the next few years to limit all your current expenditure to your revenues. And all borrowings must go towards investments to build a better future. I think that's the basic principle we must have. And unless that framework is now created in the next few years, I suspect the nature of Indian politics will damage the growth prospects of India, and we will get deeper and deeper into short-term welfare at the cost of long-term good of the country and economic growth and infrastructure. And the great opportunity that beckons us today, we'll have missed it once again. It will be a disaster. Look at China, how in 30 years' time, in 1978 or 80, China was probably even lower than India on some indicators. Per capita income was actually lower, though their education and healthcare were better. But in 30 years, they are now challenging the whole world. We have an opportunity now. We don't have to be another China, but we can definitely build prosperity into our system. We can give opportunity to everybody. We can build a harmonious society. We can fulfill most of the wants of our people and give them all hope. But if we miss this opportunity, it will be a very great tragedy for our country, 18% of global population. It will be a tragedy for humanity because we are very big. We are not a small, tiny country. Therefore, what happens to India has an impact on the world. But we also are sending a terrible signal to the world that democracy, economic growth, and rational policy are not compatible. India has to prove that freedom and growth can go together. You don't require to be autocratic or authoritarian like China or South Korea for 3-4 decades or Taiwan for 3-4 decades before they democratized themselves. Because very few countries grew from poverty to prosperity through universal franchise and democracy. India has an obligation to prove that authoritarianism is not necessary to promote rational policy and economic growth. And we have an opportunity. Actually, we've done reasonably well, even with all the failings. Now we must not lose nerve. We must hold steady and ensure economic growth with welfare and universal franchise and freedom. It's not easy, but it's a challenge that we have to accept.
Yes. I really hope the coming generation will know the consequence of their vote and the growth. Thank you so much, sir.